Ok. Madame, Monsieur, bonjour. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue au Club Suisse de la Presse. Bienvenue en ligne également. Mon nom est Isabelle Falconier. Je suis la directrice de ce club. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome at Geneva Press Club. Welcome online too. My name is Isabelle Falconier and I'm the director of this club. And I'm of course very glad to be your host today. Thank you to Fondation Courage, Courage Foundation, and especially Mrs. Heinrich Antileo for allowing this event to take place at Geneva Press Club. It is a real honor to have with us today a very courageous, a very determined person too, woman. She's both an excellent lawyer and a long-time human rights activist who is fighting for her husband, Julian Assange, but also for justice, for human rights, for freedom expression, and last but not least, for information and journalism. The Geneva Press Club co-initiated in 2021 the Geneva Call to Free Assange. Then again in 2022, the media's and journalists called to free Assange, called Speak Up for Assange. To this day, Julian Assange is still confined in Belmarsh prison in London. So here you are. Stella Moris-Assange, thank you for being with us today. You've just landed from London to share with us the latest news about Julian Assange and the 3 years legal fight against his extradition to USA, which is coming to its final phase. We'll have a 30 minutes discussion together, then we'll take your questions, both here in the room, of course, and online. First of all, Stella, how is Julian Assange?
Well, Julian is now into his 5th year in Belmarsh prison. He was arrested on the 11th of April 2019, and he just spent his 5th birthday in Belmarsh last Monday, a week ago, I think, exactly a week ago. It's been 4 years and 3 months of extreme confinement and of very dark periods, especially the first 6 months, I'd say, were extremely, or 9 months, were extremely tough. He was in a heightened state of isolation until he was moved into a different part of the prison, and then almost immediately COVID hit, and the prison system in the UK, unlike I think Italy and France, did not release any prisoners over the COVID period. They just isolated them instead. And so it was more isolation. That was year 2 and part of year 3. And now we're into year 4. And throughout this time, Julian has been fighting a very complex legal fight from within the prison, with all the difficulties that involves, not having proper access to his lawyers, having no internet access, obviously, and very limited contact with the outside world. He's able to see me and the children about once or twice a week. He's started to be able to see some friends, but other meetings have been interfered with. For example, Reporters Without Borders tried to visit him about 6 weeks ago, and the meeting was approved, and then they came to the prison to go to the meeting, and then they were told that the meeting had been cancelled by the governor, and the reason that was given was that they had intelligence that the 2 people who were visiting were journalists, and this was the Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders, Christophe Deloire, and their Global Campaigns Director, Rebecca Vincent. And to this day, they have tried to visit repeatedly, and every time it's been refused. So this is Julian's freedom of association that's interfered with. We got married on the 23rd of March last year, and that was quite a difficult feat, actually managing to get our wedding approved by the authorities. In the end, there was no valid reason to interfere with it, so it went ahead. And the photos that were taken by a prison guard, because we weren't allowed to bring in our own photographer, and those pictures are not authorized to be shared on social media or with the press. So I can't share my wedding pictures with all of you guys, even though we would love to. So it's all these tiny interferences, or very significant interferences that that are completely disproportionate and unjustified, and that's kind of a little microcosm of what Julian's reality is like. He's spends about 22 hours a day in a single cell. When he's outside of his cell, he's either fetching food. He eats alone in his cell, not out of choice, but because that's where prisoners eat their food in Belmarsh prison, alone in their cells. He has trouble sleeping. I mean, for example, just the last 2 days, there was someone new on his wing who has been screaming at 2 a.m., screaming, someone who's clearly in a disturbed mood, and of course, that's what Julian hears for several hours during the night. So when I spoke to him this morning before flying, he told me he hadn't slept after 2 because the person in the next cell was screaming. So that's just put yourself in his shoes. It's an impossible situation, but he's a very strong person, and he knows that the fight is on for his freedom, that there are lots of people who recognize this injustice, and well, I'd like to thank the Club de la Presse, because it's now the second time or the third time I know that there's an initiative to draw attention to this case. I was here in 2021 in June, and he knows that the calls for his release, for his freedom, for this injustice to come to an end are growing stronger for every day that passes.
So how would you describe his health condition?
Well, his health is in steady decline, because that's what happens if you are in a prison, especially if you've not had... Julian hasn't been a free man since 2010, and he was confined in a 110 square meter flat in Knightsbridge for 7 years before his arrest, and then now he's in the conditions in a high security prison. He had a minor stroke in October 2021. He's on medication, but obviously his physical health declines, and I'm extremely concerned that anything could happen.
What are the latest news? What about the legal procedures? What about the second and last appeal against extradition warrant to Supreme Court in London?
Well, the legal process in the UK is both extremely drawn out and also very sudden. So, for example, Julian lodged his appeal in September last year, and lodged his requesting permission to appeal. So it's actually a preliminary phase. And the High Court can hear an appeal, or it can say it won't hear an appeal. And so for 10 long months, we waited to hear back. And this was a very substantive appeal document, laying out the grounds for appeal, 152 pages, extremely important, significant points about freedom of the press, about abuse of process by the United States, about new evidence showing that the CIA director had ordered plans to kidnap or assassinate Julian, that the lead witness had retracted his testimony and said that the indictment, as far as his allegations were concerned, was false. This new evidence alone should throw out the case. And instead, we finally got a decision about 3 weeks ago from a single judge taken behind closed doors. And it was a 3-page judgment saying he wasn't going to allow those arguments to be heard in court. So that was obviously a major a disappointment, to put it lightly. It was not something I would expect, that the High Court wouldn't even hear these arguments, but that's where we are right now. So there's one last chance. There's just a single barrier to Julian's extradition now, which is going to the same level, but to a panel of 2 different judges, and trying to convince them that the first judge got it wrong. That means the legal avenues have dramatically reduced, and obviously the arguments that Julian has are very solid. The problem is that in spite of these very solid arguments, the English judiciary is closing his avenues of appeal.
So if you have to appeal in final recourse to the European Court of Human Rights, when will you think about doing that, and what chances do you then have? Well,
the European Court of Human Rights can only really be fully activated once the domestic remedies are exhausted in the UK, and that means we need to hear back from this final round whether the panel of 2 High Court judges reverse the previous decision and say, actually, we will hear these arguments. But if they confirm the decision, then we will have exhausted domestic remedies. There will be nowhere else for us to go in the UK. Quite incredibly, I mean.
And can then maybe the extradition become effective on a sudden, maybe within a few days or weeks?
Well, this is our very serious concern, because normally you would expect in an extradition case that once you've exhausted domestic remedies, you then appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. There's even an emergency method that you can go through Rule 39 to get basically an emergency injunction where the court says, while we decide on this case, you're not allowed to extradite. My major concern is that the United Kingdom has turned extremely hostile to the European Court of Human Rights, and there was a Rule 39 injunction issued a few months ago in relation to a decision by the UK government to process asylum seekers in Rwanda. And the European Court said, stop doing that. And the UK government has used that decision as kind of a bit like the same dynamic as with Brexit. You know, this is the foreigners telling us what to do and so on. So that has now shifted from the European Union to the European Court of Human Rights. So that's the political dynamic. And when it comes to Julian, it would be foolish to expect things to occur as they normally do, because if there's one rule, one pattern when it comes to Julian's case, is to expect the unexpected, expect rules to be bent or broken, expect the most extreme reaction, the most brazen violations of international law in front of the cameras, like his kidnapping, essentially, from the Ecuadorian embassy. And so that is the let's say the informed concern I have, that there's a flagrant contempt for the rule of law when it comes to the treatment of Julian. And it could very well be that the UK could just decide to extradite him with the European Court of Human Rights seized of the matter, which would be a departure with what has happened until now. But Julian's case is all about departures.
Who can now help you and Julian? A few days ago, on June 13th, you met in private with Pope Francis in Rome. Pope Francis could be of any help. What did you maybe ask him, or what can he do from the Vatican?
Well, I was extremely appreciative to Pope Francis for not only receiving me and the children, but for also making the decision to publicize it. He allowed his cameras to be there, and then for the pictures to be shared with the press and so on. So that's a very significant show of support. As you say, the meeting was private, so I can't really go into the details, but the Pope, having come from Argentina and understood or witnessed for himself political prosecutions, I think he can see it when he knows it, when he knows a political prosecution when he sees one. That's not his words, but that's my interpretation. And there's also a recognition, an implicit recognition, let's say, that this is an international issue. I mean, consider that the last place Julian was before he got arrested in the UK was here in Geneva. He was giving a testimony before the Universal Periodic Review, which was reviewing the United States in relation to WikiLeaks publications about the Iraq war logs. And from there, he went to the UK, and there, a few days later, he was arrested. So that's kind of the message that's being sent out. That if you're someone who is putting grave human rights violations and war crimes onto the public record and calling perpetrators to account and asking for reform and basically taking the Universal Declaration of Human Rights seriously and using that as your guiding, your guide to what we're trying to achieve as a global community and as a human rights community, then you will be punished and you will be hounded and you will be persecuted. That's kind of the essence of the message that is being sent. And of course, Julian's an Australian citizen. He's in the United Kingdom. He was publishing from Europe. He's not a US citizen. He wasn't working for the US government. He's not a whistleblower. He's a publisher. He received the information from Chelsea Manning. So all of these elements show that Julian's case is a case for the international community to solve. He can't fall between the cracks because he was acting on the, let's say, the mandate of the UN Charter. He was acting on the mandate that the UN institutions in this very city are charged with. So that means that the international community needs to step in. When I say international community, I'm talking at every single level. I'm talking about the grassroots, I'm talking about the media, I'm talking about politicians, heads of state, and so on. And we have seen great progress over the last, I'd say, year, where you have heads of state like the Mexican president, the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, the Prime Minister of Australia, saying that Julian should no longer be in prison, that the case should come to an end, and so on. And you know, various international institutions that have issued statements. So I think the special position that the Pope has, and also that obviously UN institutions, but perhaps Switzerland as a country has, is that they play a unique role of using their good offices in order to create a political environment in which a solution can be found.
Precisely, the Human Rights Council is holding its 53rd session just now, till July 14th, a few yards away from here. What would be your message to the Human Rights Council, and maybe especially to its High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk?
Well, the persecution of Julian is basically a very flagrant dismantling of long-standing norms that have existed for the past 70 years. And freeing Julian is really necessary to reaffirm and regain the standing of those norms. That war crimes can't go unpunished, or there shouldn't be impunity when very grave abuses are revealed. That you can't just put journalists and publishers in prison. You can't charge them with 175 years under a bogus Espionage Act prosecution. All these things need to be corrected. And so the United Nations has the various mandates that are affected by Julian's prosecution and undermined by the actions of the United States and its allies in keeping Julian imprisoned. And the United Nations special rapporteurs have followed this case. I met with Bachelet last year, and she expressed her concern and her will that this case be followed with her with the new High Commissioner for Human Rights. We are engaging the UN offices in relation to Julian's case, and well, my message would be to continue to issue the statements because what is needed is a ever greater show of support for Julian and demand for his freedom.
Yeah. A letter is being sent to here in Switzerland to Ignazio Cassis, the Swiss Federal Councillor, conseiller fédéral en charge des affaires extérieures, signed by more than 20 Swiss politicians from Geneva and from the rest of Switzerland. Do you think this kind of initiative can be useful to help you free Assange?
It's extremely important, and I think it's also extremely important. I've been told that the support is from across the political spectrum, and we see this throughout in Australia with the political parties across the political spectrum, and also in Europe and in the UK, parliamentarians from the right of the Conservative Party to the very left and centre. So. It's an important message to show that this case goes to the very heart of a kind of open and democratic society that we need to preserve and defend, or it will be completely lost. And that's not about right wing or left wing, that's about whether we want a democracy at all. So this unity and political support for a very basic demand that Julian not be extradited to the country that has plotted to assassinate him is the kind of thing that needs to continue. And of course, in terms of what the Swiss government can do, the Swiss government specializes in utilizing its, let's say, its quiet talks to move things behind the scenes and to create the right climate for issues that are perhaps a little bit haven't moved to encourage movement in the right direction. And that's where I see Switzerland, and there are very few countries or entities that are actually in a position to do that, and Switzerland is one.
And, well, how are you personally, Stella? I mean, you've been dealing with this situation for, well, 10 years. You're both, Julian and you, parents of 2 small children. How do you cope with that personally?
Well, I cope by working towards his freedom, by always having that goal in mind. I don't entertain a future where Julian is not freed. He has to be freed, and I don't underestimate the power and influence of our allies. I mean, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a case that has so much support from human rights organizations, all the major ones, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, etc., all the major press freedom groups, Committee to Protect Journalists in the US, Reporters Without Borders, and so on. So all the subject experts, and as I said, the UN, the various offices of the UN, whoever looks at this case and really takes the time to analyze it and understand not just the case but the implications, is on the same side. And the persecutors are actually extremely isolated, and it's very hard to find someone who actually defends Julian's prosecution and extradition. And what you usually find is the ones who do are normally implicated in the crimes. Like there's a very vocal person on Twitter, well, he used to be a prosecutor in Guantanamo Bay. Sure, he wants Julian prosecuted because Julian exposed crimes. He exposed practices of torture, things that implicate others in crimes. And so they don't want to be in the courtroom. They want Julian to be shut down and silenced because they have skin in the game.
Thank you, Stella. I suggest we take now some questions from here and also from online. Please raise your hand. There is a microphone coming to you. And please, of course, start by presenting yourself. So we'll have the microphone first here. Monsieur. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you, Julian Assange.
Can you please present yourself, please, and the media you're working for?
Did ICRC once try ever to contact Julian Assange in front or behind the scene?
I'm not aware. I mean, that's not to say that they haven't. I know that there was a visit of the ICRC to Belmarsh, which Julian was not aware of, and I've been told that Belmarsh didn't facilitate, but I can't say for certain.
Okay. Monsieur, please, s'il vous plaît, présentez-vous.
C'était mon intention.
Merci.
Mon nom est Christian Campiche. Juste une remarque. It's a remark. It's not. It's a position because it's not a question. I am the founder of the online newspaper La Méduse, Info Méduse in Switzerland. I founded 20 years ago, and I'm the former president of Impressum, the biggest association of journalists in Switzerland. And I am the honor president of the Press and Blame campaign. And I was one of the first signers who signed this position of journalists. More than 1,000 journalists signed it 2 or 3 years ago. And I would like to thank the Club de la Presse to organize this meeting, because I'm a very strong sustainer of the freedom for Julian Assange, and I made a song for him. It's called Free Assange Now. That's on YouTube, and I would like very much that this song could be more popularized. And it's in these words. Let me please just sing this song, Free Assange Now. I don't sing it because I don't have my guitar, but I can do it next time. Free Assange now, free Assange now, free him now. 1, 2, 3, 4, free. Let the truth be free. Keep courage. Free him now. Free Assange now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci. Another question? Alors, Madame devant.
Yes, hello. Agnès Pedro, journalist from AFP here in Geneva. On your visit here in Geneva, I wanted to know if you plan to visit, if you have some visit organized with the High Commissioner, the actual High Commissioner, or with other UN representatives, or other representatives of the Geneva International. Not Switzerland, but the Geneva International, the UN.
Not on this trip. I'm flying back this evening, but we are people on Julian's legal team, have been in Geneva just last week. There are ongoing discussions, but I'm not at liberty to talk about them. But I mean, there's a possibility that I may be coming in September, I think.
On va repasser le micro à Madame de l'AFP, s'il vous plaît, merci.
But did you request it to meet Volker Turk this time?
Not this time, no.
And what is you are doing this Club Suisse de la Presse, but is there a specific reason why you come today in Geneva, in Switzerland?
For this event.
The urgency of the situation in London. Monsieur juste là, oui. Lui mettre le micro tout près.
Thank you very much. And one thing, I'm Jacques France, and I'm an independent blogger. And I precise, I've never written about Julian, but I will write about this event, obviously. I've got two questions. First question, is Julian aware about the mobilization that is going on during all these years, and does it somehow comfort him? That's my first question. And my second question is there any hope with the American elections coming next year?
Julian is aware of the worldwide movement to free him. I mean, it really is a worldwide movement, and it's very admirable because it is both completely global and also very local across every continent. In Australia, we've seen a really successful grassroots movement that has changed the policy. For about 11 years, the Australian government was in lockstep with the United States, didn't say anything when asked about Julian, pretended like this was just some case concerning an Australian abroad, and that's all it was. We've seen a shift now with the current government, and it's not surprising because what happened was that people got organized and there was an election, and they were asking all the candidates what their position was on Julian. And the group that holds the power balance in the Australian government, it's TEALS, they're called, they all ran on a ticket of freeing Julian. And the polls, the latest polls, showed about 3 months ago, it was about 80% of the Australian population wanted Julian to be able to come back to Australia and for him to be released. And then 1 month later, it was 88%. 89%. So this is the signal from the Australian population. And of course, at that point, it not only becomes safe, but actually profitable for politicians to take this position, that Julian should be freed, that the Australian government is working to free him, and so on. And even the leader of the opposition, who is known to be very conservative on all sorts of issues, has also said that the position of the opposition party is that Julian needs to be able to come home, and his incarceration should end. So that's a major success in Australia, and of course Australia is very significant, being Julian's home country, for a shift in gears, let's say, to free him, and that's down to popular mobilization. The second question was, the elections. It's very, I don't know. I mean, no, because look, it's kind of interesting because all the major contenders, except for Ron DeSantis, on both the Republican and the Democrat side, have taken a position to free Julian. So you have Vivek Ramaswamy in the Republican side, who says he will pardon Julian. Ron DeSantis, of course, was a Guantanamo Bay prosecutor, another one. He doesn't want Julian free. And then on the other side, you have Marianne Williamson and Robert Kennedy Jr., who have also said that they would pardon Julian. Of course, everyone expects Biden to be reelected, and Biden could end this anytime. It's not in the administration's interest for Julian to be tried during an election period. The UK is is giving off the signals that it is kind of accelerating and wants Julian extradited. So Julian could very well be extradited by the end of the summer. It's perfectly possible. And then the Biden administration would have to deal with that. And I don't think that's in their interest. The smart thing to do would be to just drop it and end it. Julian's already spent over 4 years in prison, so he's never going to get that time back. But this case is an inconvenience also for the Biden administration. It's never been a straightforward thing. It's been extremely controversial throughout each of the administrations. The Obama administration that decided not to prosecute him, and even commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence. The Trump administration did charge him in 2017. December 2017 was when the arrest warrant came in. The UK was notified immediately and then pretended like nothing was happening until the day of his arrest, and then revealed, we actually have had a sealed indictment for over a year lying in the office. The Trump administration, Department of Justice, had 2 prosecutors working on the case who resigned from the case, went to different cases because they disagreed with the Espionage Act charges. So it's internally controversial, and it always has been. And in March this year, the progressive wing of the Democrat Party, so that's Rashida Tlaib and AOC and a number of others, signed an open letter asking Biden and the Attorney General to drop the case, both because of the extreme danger it poses to the First Amendment, which is the US protection for freedom of expression, but also because of the detrimental effect it has, not just for foreign policy, for promoting press freedom, but very concretely in freeing journalists all over the world, because what it is a license to jail journalists. You can do it to Assange. The US can do it to Assange. In the UK, well, then there's no one who's keeping up any standard, so it's a free-for-all.
We'll take 2 questions here, then we switch to online. Monsieur, sir.
Yes, good afternoon, Mrs. Assange. I have a 2-part question. The first comment is, it reminds me of the article in the Washington Post in 1972, the journalist having the position, the obligation to tell the world, and your comment on that. And the second part of my question is, Mr. Ben Cohen was arrested in Virginia last week. Do you have news from him? Thank you.
Sorry, the first question, was that?
Your comment on that journalists have an obligation to tell the world. And that was from the Washington Post.
Right. Well, I think it comes down to what is journalism, right? If journalism is really about holding power to account, you have to be able to tell the truth. And we've seen a kind of progressive erosion of our ability to publish and speak. Julian's prosecution is it's a message to every journalist that it's basically a bullying tactic, and the precedent it sets is that the same argument can be used against anyone else. That's why the New York Times and the Washington Post have issued their editorial positions that the case should be dropped. We know that it is already inhibiting people from speaking out. I encounter it all the time. I was just listening to a podcast the other day called Wind of Change, about CIA psychological operations during the Cold War and so on. And they have, like, just as I was listening to it, there was a conversation between a journalist and the source who was going to talk about something that happened 30 years ago, and they said, no, I can't do that. I don't want to be Julian Assange. So this is just an anecdote, and everyone I speak to, I had a panel discussion last week with Chris Hedges, who used to be an investigative journalist at the New York Times, and he was speaking to his colleagues at the New York Times, and they were telling him, well, there's no investigations anymore at the New York Times. The sources have stopped talking. We're not willing to publish, basically. So this is the Assange effect, and this is a global effect, of course, because Julian's not in the United States. He's not American, and it sets the new standard that investigative journalism, if you publish where it hurts, those with authority and power and so on, they're going to come down even harder. And who's going to be willing to risk their life and liberty? No one. So journalism is basically a dying or dead profession, unless this trend can be reversed. And it's not like you have to invent anything new, you just have to enforce the standards that existed up until a few years ago. In relation to Ben Cohen, I think it's admirable. He's a long-standing supporter. He visited Julian in the embassy, and I think it's important that people are willing to put themselves out there, and not just express their views around the dinner table with in environments where they know they won't be challenged. The stakes are too high for that, and frankly, the situation is too urgent for people to just be quiet and be afraid to speak out.
Thank you. Monsieur Metton?
Thank you. I am Guy Mettan. I am the former director of the Press Club, and presently I am deputy at the Geneva Parliament. Just 2 remarks. I had the pleasure to organize the first press conference with Julian here in 2010. It was in November 2010, so a long time ago, and also the pleasure to meet him and to interview him at the Ecuadorian embassy in London in 2015. So just to mention, it's a very long fight. It's now 13 years, but what is very encouraging is that the world attention didn't disappear, because all the hope was there to make the Assange case disappear from the scene. So I think it will be a successful fight, even if it is not yet finished. And secondly, just to mention, you mentioned the letter of the Swiss deputies. Yes, we gather with EUNWE, we gather now just 37 members of parliaments from Geneva mainly, which will sign this letter, who have signed the letter to our Federal Councillor Ignazio Cassis, to asking him to make any efforts possible to help to free Julian. So that was my 2 remarks.
And
thanks.
when the letter will be sent?
Tomorrow. We have just
okay.
to see with Ayun, but it will be sent tomorrow to our Federal Councillor. Thanks.
Perfect. We'll come back to the room, but we'll take one question online. Please present yourself, whoever you are. Thank you.
We have one question from a Brazilian journalist, Jamil Shade, who is asking, how do you see the support of Lula and what else can he do? And the second question is, would Assange accept asylum in Brazil?
Well, Lula's support is really very important, obviously. This is Brazil. I think he also feels personally connected to Julian because, of course, Lula was himself a victim of a politically motivated prosecution to keep him out of the presidency. And eventually, thanks to investigative journalism, it was revealed that there was a plot, and he was eventually freed. Obviously, when Lula speaks, the world listens. And it is important that world leaders are able to perform this role, because when it comes to international politics, everyone's on the same level, and you have to be able to reference the rules that you all agreed to abide to, that you all signed up to, that you all said were binding, and that's what Lula's doing. And I'm very, very grateful to him for having the courage and also the courage to say that Julian should be free. For example, when he was in the UK for King Charles's coronation at the press conference, he talked about Julian and how Julian should be freed, and this was a huge injustice. And he keeps on saying it. And he calls out those who are allowing this to continue and remaining silent. In terms of asylum, Julian should not have to receive asylum. This is not to discourage any country from granting it, of course. Julian needs all the protection he can get. But if we have a functioning international legal system, a system that defends human rights, that protects human rights defenders, that doesn't punish journalists and publishers, that upholds the rule of law, then Julian should be free, full stop. He shouldn't need any additional protection. So that's what we should all be working towards, a re-establishment of the norms and the standards that I grew up thinking were the generally agreed standards, and not just me, like there are official documents signed in this very city that that were created for just that reason, and everyone has to continue to behave like those are still the law, because they are, and that any departure from those standards should not and will not be tolerated. So, by all means, I hope not just Brazil or Mexico or other countries, if willing, grant Julian political asylum, but that should not be necessary, and he needs to be just a free man.
French parliamentary asked for their government to offer free also asylum.
Yes, I think these initiatives are very significant. You know, I think it's politically important, and that whatever means there is to protect Julian, both effectively and politically, should be embarked on and publicized and secured.
We'll take our second question online, please. This time.
Hi, Stella. Latika Burke from the Sydney Morning Herald. Thanks for taking the question. There's been strong encouragement in Australia for your husband's release, but that seems to be conditional on him accepting some sort of plea deal. Is this an option that is open to you, or is this non-negotiable?
Look, I'm not going to discuss the range of topics that are rumors that are flying about. The case should be dropped. Julian's done nothing wrong, but the priority is for him to be freed. Julian could have a catastrophic health incident any moment, and he has been in a high security prison for 4 years and 3 months, and this is indefinite. And the United States is threatening a 175-year sentence. The priority here is for all the people who are involved, and this is a political case, so that involves the Australian government, to come together and find a solution to free him. And Julian has just, as I said, published the truth about crimes committed by the country that is trying to extradite him, which is the same country that plotted to assassinate him. So he should not be extradited to the country that plotted his assassination. It's that simple.
Thank you. We'll take your third question online, please.
Yes, hi, hello. My name is Gabriela Galindo. I'm a journalist for Geneva Solutions. Thanks for taking my question. So the first one was related to the role of the European Court of Human Rights that you addressed. And yeah, you sort of said that that was, even that was questionable, like to have a positive outcome from that. So I guess with that in mind, my question would be then, if the UK system disappoints you once again, then who else could you turn to? You mentioned certain governments, specifically Switzerland, for example, but are there any others that you are holding hope for? What about the institutions in Geneva specifically? And my second question is, has this shaken your confidence in the international system, and specifically in governments that say they are democratic, but is this case against Assange ultimately just a matter of what certain governments will tolerate? Thank you.
So in relation to the appeals, well, the question is whether the UK will, if it denies all the appeals, whether it will extradite Julian before European Court of Human Rights decision or in spite of a Rule 39 emergency injunction. It's speculative at this point. I would hope that they just enforce law and practice and wait for the European Court to issue a ruling. But obviously there's a risk, as I explained, and the stakes are too high to ignore that risk. And I think Julian's case just requires for existing rules to be enforced. And that's all that is necessary. And in fact, if staying silent basically is a complicity in allowing those very rules to be undermined. So I would hope it's not just one or two governments, but every government that makes the demand that these rules are not undermined and that Julian be treated as a human being and as a, well, fairly would mean he wouldn't be in prison at all, right? And he would never have to suffer for having published the truth. The second question was about, what was it?
Can you please repeat your second question?
Sorry.
Yes, of course. It was a broader question. I wanted to know if the what is happening to Assange and to you also, has it shaken your hope or your confidence rather in the international system to uphold democratic values and also about the role of governments that specifically tout themselves as democratic, and whether that support for democracy is contingent on or it's just a matter of what these governments are willing to tolerate.
Well, I think democracy is not a marketing pitch. It's not it's not what all sorts of governments say they're fair and democratic, and then it's really the practice that comes to define them. And so this is a constant battle. It's not like there ever was a golden age. But what's clear is that freedom of the press and freedom of expression right now are under very severe attack, both through deploying and abusing the law, as in Julian's case, and Russia's doing the same with Evan Gershkovich. I mean, these are two mirror cases where you see both Julian and Evan Gershkovich. He's a Wall Street Journal reporter. He's basically accused of news gathering, and he is being charged under the Russian Espionage Act, just like Julian is accused of news gathering and charged under the US Espionage Act. The activity is not actually espionage. What is being, what the criminal activity that they're describing is engaging in news gathering. And so you see that the new standard that's established is that you can define journalism as espionage and treat the public as the enemy. If you consider the public the enemy of the national interest, then every journalist is a spy for the public. This shift of the moving of the goalposts is something that's happened not so recently now. I mean, it's been several years of, and it's rather novel in the United States, because the United States has had a very strong protection of the First Amendment since its inception. It's the very first time that they use the Espionage Act against a publisher for receiving information from a source and publishing it and making it public. That's the accusation. 17 charges under the Espionage Act for receiving, possessing, and communicating information to the public. There's always going to be a struggle between those in power who want to preserve their power and the function of the press to expose abuse of power. The difference now is that there's a greater willingness to deploy, for example, the Espionage Act in the US, or to play along in the UK, and to some extent also the West more generally, because it has failed to prevent Julian's imprisonment and failed to call out those who are keeping him in prison. This is a major failure by the West. And so the willingness to deploy these legally coercive measures that criminalize press activity on the one hand, and then you also have the shutting down of speech more generally, not just of journalists, but of people just having conversations on social media. And this is a very opaque process, and these things go hand in hand. And so the general attack on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, is concerted, and the tools by the censors, the tools by the ones who want to shut down this ability to speak, are growing more and more powerful by the day.
We'll take your last question online, this time with video, before coming back briefly to the room here.
Yes, do I have the mic? Stella, first let me say how much we all admire the fight you're conducting for Julian, your courage and your stamina. I have two questions. The first is regarding what activists can do. We now call Day X the day that the court, or the British High Court, will announce whether they will grant a further audience to Julian. If they don't, that would be the last chance he has in Britain, as you mentioned. So we're planning a mass demonstration in front of the High Court, and hanging up in countries around the world, hanging up yellow ribbons outside the embassies. And I was wondering if there's anything else we can do, in your opinion. But that's Day X. There's also Day Y, which is the day when the police van comes to Belmarsh prison to take Julian to the airport. We hope that does not ever come, but if it does, what can we do to forcefully show our disapproval of that act? Have you any suggestions for us as activists? That's my first question. My second question regards Julian
Sir,
and his,
Stella will answer first shortly the first question, and then you will ask a second brief one. Thank you.
All right.
Stella?
Well, yes, there's something we call Day X, which is we don't have a date for the final hearing, but it's coming, and so the day we know which day it is, we will change X for the actual date. But that's for people to organize. There is no utility in differentiating Day X and Day Y, Day Y being the day of his extradition. We don't know if it will be the same day. This is the urgency that I'm trying to convey, is that Julian is in an extremely precarious situation. He could be extradited within a matter of weeks. Obviously, this public hearing has to happen first, but we don't know what happens from there. And the way the kind of thing that we've witnessed over the years when it comes to Julian is to expect the unexpected, to expect extreme measures, to expect rules being broken and all sorts of things. So don't delay preparing for Day Y. Prepare for Day Y. there are various actions that activists can take. I have a toolkit which I've tweeted out that has various that is being updated ongoingly. So I'd urge people to go to look at the toolkit and also sign up to the Don't Extradite Assange website newsletter.
Okay, sir, your second question, but please, brief one, thank you.
Okay, yes, we're translating that toolkit into Italian for our Italian activists. The second question is about Julian's future. It's clear that the United States and the United Kingdom do not, and Great Britain, do not want to permit Julian to be free because they do not want him to start WikiLeaks up again and make new revelations. So, is there some compromise solution between absolute freedom and not starting up WikiLeaks? For example, would Julian accept to live in some small isolated town in Australia with you and the family with no internet connection, therefore he cannot do any, or as far as the United States and Britain are concerned, any damage anymore?
Well, WikiLeaks' legacy is there to stay. WikiLeaks has published authentic documents that journalists used to do their in-depth investigations and continue to do so, because what you have there is a high-resolution history without a filter of public relations, projection, and so on. So I don't think WikiLeaks needs to prove itself. And in terms of Julian, I mean, Julian has to have his life back, and I'm talking has to be able to leave a 2x3 meter cell where he's spent 4.5 years almost, and be able to walk through a park and hold his children's hands without the regime of a prison visitors hall, and go to a restaurant and go to the movies and all these things. Julian needs his life back. He's not, this is, I understand Julian's historical significance, his contribution to journalism and all that, but Julian is more than what he's done. Julian's a man that needs to be able to live his life, and that's my priority, that's our priority. We need to be able to be a family, and all these considerations that the question refers to, I don't think they're relevant, because we're just talking about a man that needs to regain his freedom and get his life back.
Okay, we'll come back into two more questions then, because there are some TVs who need to have a moment with Stella. So just wait for the microphone to come. Voilà.
Hello, Julian Spurry from CH Media, West correspondent in French-speaking Switzerland. I wanted to ask you a question about the consequences for your family. How are you and your children coping with the situation, and what is keeping you, what makes you keeping the hope, your family?
Well, the consequences are severe. Our children have had to experience our family life inside a single room that's a bit bigger than this one, seated at a table, and those are all their interactions with their father are in that room, with the exception of the day we got married, in which we were in a different room in the prison. When you have someone in prison, you are effectively imprisoning the rest of the family. In order to keep our family life going in the very limited way that we can, we are constantly awaiting the next visit date and then arrange our lives around the visit dates, which vary from week to week. And that involves, well, you can just imagine you have 1 or 2 days a week that change from day to day, hour to hour, but you just adapt around those dates. And the children obviously ask questions, and they're growing up, and prison is a major feature of their lives. They dream of prison, they ask about prison, they have nightmares about prison, and they play out being in prison. It's a major part of our lives. I don't tell the children about the extradition, because why would I do that? I mean, that would be extremely cruel. And we just have to basically adapt to whatever happens, and the way this process unfolds. It dominates every single aspect of our lives.
On peut passer le micro à monsieur ici. Sir.
My name is Richard Golding. I'm an independent consultant. I find myself listening to you thinking, what can be done to influence politicians and lawmakers, particularly in the jurisdictions of the UK and the US, who are clearly center stage in this? And I'm almost bereft of answers. But is there anything you can say about your experience so far, and in the days, weeks ahead, about the efforts that you've made to get the story even paid attention to on mainstream media? Whatever any of us think about mainstream media, it's still a reality. And to the extent that it influences politicians' thinking, and even 2 high court judges maybe, if they see something on the headline news, or have you tried, and if you've been rejected, I'd be interested to know what reasons they give. But could you say a bit more about your attempts to get the story even covered on mainstream media? Thank you.
Look, they're doing to Julian whatever they think they can get away with. And it's kind of the same attitude as the CIA black sites in Guantanamo Bay and so on. If they can get away with it, they'll do it, down to torture and extrajudicial killings and so on. And I think this is a very dark instinct that exists within certain elements of the state. Not every state, maybe, but certainly the ones that Julian's dealing with. And part of the difficulty has been that this is basically a war of attrition. That the United States took 9 years to reveal it was really going after him and wanted to put him on trial. So for years we were dealing with a situation where the press was saying, well, he's paranoid and no one's after him and this and that. And so part of the problem has been that the way the case was reported about, which was very sloppily and uncritically, led a certain narrative to develop around Julian. And when this narrative turned out to be the exact opposite, the media was reluctant to flip, because flipping would entail recognizing that actually what had come before was sloppy and uncritical. So I think there's part of that. There's a little bit of hubris involved, but then there's the natural the way the media works, which is there's a lot going on all the time. And then a case like this, as I said, Julian puts in his appeal, waits 10 months, then there's a decision to reject. The court case is quite complex and all these things. One of the problems I see with the way the media has covered the case is to follow the court case and to treat it as if this were a legal process rather than a political process, which is what it is, which kind of goes linked to the original problem. However, I think there's been a big shift, actually. You have all the subject experts, as I said earlier, and there are now several books that do have gone into a deep investigation into the case, notably Stefania Maurizi, Italian investigative journalist. This book has won several investigative awards of the highest order. It's called WikiLeaks and Its Enemies. It's in English, and I think it's coming out in French. It's in Italian as well. And Niels Meltzer, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who wrote a history of a story of prosecution, the case of Julian Assange, a story of prosecution, also in German and English and Swedish and French. So these two books, and there are others, Kevin Gostola as well, and there are some others. I'm sorry for not mentioning all of them because they're not in my head. But these two specifically, I think, have made a major contribution because they've allowed me, for example, to go and say, well, if you want to look into that issue, the last 13 years of history in this case, read those books, because I'm not going to take up, 4 minutes of a 6-minute interview to trot on things that have already been investigated and resolved by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, for example, like read the report, read this book. So I think there's huge progress, and the allies that Julian has in the NGOs and the press freedom groups, and of course shows of support like the Pope, I think that shifts attitude significantly. And that kind of thing needs to continue. Julian was shortlisted for the Sakharov Prize last year by the European Parliament. That also shows a very significant shift. And I think it's just at this stage about people not being fully informed and understanding the stakes. And of course, the mainstream media has a role to play there. I think probably what one needs is a campaign, like you see in the UK, the Daily Mail or the Guardian. When they have an issue that they campaign on, they don't call it a campaign, but they do campaign through their newspapers, and that hasn't happened. And there are political reasons for that. There's the Guardian's own backstory with Julian and WikiLeaks and their involvement in the release of the password and all these things that are reasons why I think explain why that hasn't happened. The Daily Mail is it hasn't been bad, the Daily Mail, but it hasn't taken this on as a campaigning issue and so on. The United States is really where the real efforts should be. As I said, the New York Times and Washington Post and I think USA Today and so on, they've put out editorial statements. The 5 original partners have said it should be dropped and so on. But they're not campaigning on it. And of course, my measure for what should be the coverage, when it comes to The Guardian, for example, is the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial. It was impossible to go on their website for about 6 weeks or whatever it was without having Johnny Depp and Amber Heard forced down your eyeballs. And that's what they do when they want you to have something in front of you. So that's what should be happening.
Stella, thank you very much. We'll stop the press conference, but if you have more individual questions, please stay. We'll find time for that. The medias, TVs who requested an interview, please just come here over here so we can organize. And well, thank you everyone here in the room or online for being here today. Stella, thank you again, and really courage be with you for the next weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.